In the 18th century, the colonization of the Western world led to a large transport of various goods and commodities between the colonized spaces in Europe. Sugarcane, tobacco, and many of the other new cash crops coming in from the West had turned the colonies into a source of income for European investors, which led to a culture of mercantilism amongst the imperialist nations. Although these newly obtained materials carried a substantial monetary and cultural weight, their harvest required a large, physically apt workforce that would be required to perform back-breaking labor in deplorable conditions from dawn until dusk. Rather than risk their own men and people's well-being, the colonists chose to use the seemingly endless amount of slave labor that had become available during the conquest of Africa, leading to the height of the slave trade. The triangular trade saw slaves bought in Africa transported across the Atlantic to be traded for goods. Then those goods returned to Europe so that the process could begin again. The trip across the Atlantic became known as the Middle Passage and was a 3-month-long voyage by way of slave ship from the coast of Africa to the West Indies or the southern coast of the American colonies. After being taken from their homes, the slaves were caged and rushed to the coast, where they could then be quickly shackled and loaded onto large slave ships and packed into a tight holding space. Often, they were given less room than the inanimate cargo being transported, such as whiskey barrels. With higher numbers of slaves being delivered being equivalent to more money, there was a push to fit as many slaves as possible into the hold. This led to spooning, the act of forcing the slaves to lay on their side, pressed against one another. This method allowed slave ship captains to squeeze as many human bodies as possible onto their ships, though, due to the increase in number of bodies and decrease in space, along with the hot and humid conditions usually seen throughout the transatlantic voyage, malnourishment, and subhuman treatment of the slaves, injuries, disease, and death ran rampant on these ships. This was not profitable for the Europeans and led to the Slave Trade Act of 1788. The Slave Trade Act limited the number of slaves that could be carried on ships based on tonnage, and also required a surgeon to be present on board each vessel, and suggested that ships be paid bonuses for low mortality rates. This seemed to decrease the number of casualties, as British ships who employed these laws and methods saw a drop in the number of deaths, while Dutch ships who did not saw stagnant mortality rates. Even with slightly better conditions on ships, average mortality rates usually ranged between 40 to 45%, with 10 to 15% of the slave population dying prior to even boarding the vessels. Since each slave was considered an investment, it would stand to reason that a physician needed to be present during the grueling journey of the Middle Passage. But prior to the Slave Trade Act, this was not the case, and even though surgeons were present and paid handsomely to keep slaves and crew members alive, their methods of practice were often morbid and brutal, with little care about the slaves' general well-being aside from keeping them alive. In some cases, surgeons were even said to have participated in the punishment of slaves who resisted treatment or nutrition, which was a form of passive resistance to their captors, via flogging or the forced swallowing of red-hot coals. Many surgeons aboard these slave ships recorded books and diaries of their experiences. James Irving was a surgeon turned slave ship captain who, on his maiden voyage, wrecked the ship, and he and his men were then sold into slavery. Upon his eventual emancipation by parties in Britain, and despite his experiences, he immediately returned to the slave trade. The next account is of Alexander Falconbridge and his novel, An Account of the Slave Trade on the Coast of Africa. Falconbridge, a slave ship surgeon who later turned abolitionist, wrote in detail about the egregious conditions in which the slaves were contained, as well as the horrors of their treatment on the ship during their capture, taking accounts directly from slaves who had been on the same ships as him. In another account on the Guinea surgeons on the Middle Passage, Falconbridge is quoted as denoting the primary cause of the constant dysentery among slaves to what he described as sudden transitions from heat to cold, breathing a putrid atmosphere, wallowing in their own excrement, and being shackled together. This highlights the abhorrent and inhumane conditions that slaves were kept in during the journey. Upon landing, the slaves were then to be auctioned off and sold as quickly as possible, leading to what is now known as the scramble, where slaves were rushed from the ship and led directly to the auction block. It comes as no surprise that many slaves arrived in less than ideal states of health, many being on the brink of death or severely ill from diseases contracted on board the vessel, and that it was the final duty of the ship's surgeon to prepare the slaves for auction. Slaves were shaved and cleaned, and then often covered in oil in order to make their skin appear more shiny and healthy after their arduous journey, and their anuses were then plugged with corks to prevent leakage from the many who had dysentery. Gray hairs were darkened, and the slaves were given food and rum to make them look full and in good health rather than starving. Once prepared, the slaves were then sent off to auction to be sold to the highest bidder. Even after its ban towards the end of the 18th century, the demand for slave labor did not dwindle, though the number of slaves imported began to decline towards the end of the 19th century. Given even this brief overview of the experience of slaves on slave ships and the roles of the surgeons aboard who were meant to keep them alive, it is clear to see the dark, candid relationship between medicine and the slave trade along the Middle Passage.